is chapter 25 of Laura Hillenbrand's book, Unbroken. We're jumping in today at page 254. You might remember that in chapter 24, Louie's at the prisoner of war camp, and we learn more about the bird. And Louie starts to be targeted by the bird, by Watanabe more and more, because Louie is really defiant. And it's important to the bird that the prisoners are submissive to him, give in to him. We also see the prisoners start to have little acts of rebellion, and it said they're not just prisoners anymore, they're soldiers, and they're finding ways to fight back against their captors. And at the very end of chapter 24, there's a message that goes out on Japanese radio that says Louie's alive, but that message isn't picked up and sent back to Torrance or Louie's family for months, so they still don't know he's alive. And chapter 25 is called B29, so here we go. On one of the last days of October 1944, Louie pushed a wheelbarrow over the Omori Bridge, through the village at the bridge's end, and into Tokyo. With him were another POW and a guard. They'd been ordered to pick up meat for the POW rations. Louie had been in Japan for 13 months, but this was the first time that he had passed, unblindfolded, into the society that held him captive. Tokyo was blood dry. There were no young men anywhere. The war had caused massive shortages in food and goods, and the markets and restaurants were shuttered. The civilians were shipshod and unbathed. Everyone knew that the Americans were coming, and the city seemed to be holding its breath. Teams of children and teenagers were shoveling out slit trenches and tearing down buildings to make fire breaks. Louie, the other POW, and the guard arrived at a slaughterhouse where their wheelbarrow was filled with horse meat. As they pushed it back toward Omori, Louie looked up at the building and saw graffiti scrawled over one wall. It said, B. Niju Ku. The first character was simple enough, the English letter B. Louie knew that Niju meant 20 and Ku meant 9, although he didn't know that Ku carried another meaning. Pain, calamity, or like terrible things happening, affliction. Louie walked the wheelbarrow into Omori, wondering what B29 referred to, and why someone would write it on a wall. Remember that Louie, while he's in the camp, is really isolated. They don't have news of the outside world. They don't know what's going on. And so while other people would know what this B29 meant, Louie has no idea. At 10 minutes to 6, on the morning of November 1st, 1944, a wondrous American plane lifted off a runway on Saipan. Its size boggled the imagination. 99 feet long, 141 feet from wingtip to wingtip, almost 30 feet high at the tail, and weighing 120,000 pounds or more loaded. It dwarfed the famously huge B-24. Right? B-24 was the plane that Louie crashed in, and now we're talking about the B-29, and it's even bigger. Powered by 4 2,200 horsepower engines, each engine almost twice as powerful as each of those of the B-24, it could rocket across the sky at up to 358 miles per hour and carry giant bomb loads. A B-24 didn't have a prayer of making it from Saipan to Japan's home islands and back. This plane could do it. It was the B-29 Super Fortress, and it would bring down Japan. The bomber, soon to be named Tokyo Rose, as a mocking homage to the woman who broadcast Japanese propaganda, was piloted by Captain Ralph Steakley. That morning, he flew his plane north. The plane split the air nearly 6 miles up. Above was a sky of intense blue. Below, sliding over the horizon, came Japan. The B-29s had been used a handful of times over Japan in raids launched from China beginning 4.5 months earlier. Largely because of the difficulty of supplying the Chinese bases and flying the vast distances between those bases in Japan, the missions had been ineffective. But to the Japanese, the swift leviathans, like giant monsters, were terrifying, inspiring the graffiti that Louie had seen. 3 weeks after the first China-based raid, Saipan had been captured, and American planes had shifted to launching B-29s from there. Steakley's was the first run from Saipan to Tokyo, which hadn't seen an American plane since the Doolittle raid in 1942. Remember, because of where Tokyo is, it's an island, it's so hard to reach. It's so far from the U.S. But now that Saipan is captured, they can get closer and closer to Tokyo, which means that they can more easily send planes over there. His plane carried not bombs, but cameras. Stickley was mapping the path for the B-29s that would follow his. At noon, the plane reached the city. So they don't have satellites, right? There's no Google Earth at this point in time. So they're sending planes over Tokyo to take pictures of what's there, like we would use satellite images. Louie was standing in a group of POWs doing calisthenics exercises on the orders of the guards when a siren began sounding. The guards, as usual during alerts, shooed the men into the barracks. The POWs were used to the sirens, which had always been false alarms, so the alert caused little concern. In the barracks, the men peered out of the windows. Something was different. The guards were gaping at the sky, staring. As if, wrote Bob Martindale, they were looking for the Messiah. Then there was a glint above, a finger pointing urgently, and a crush of POWs bolting for the door. Running into the compound with his face skyward, Louie saw a silver, radiant white light high over Tokyo, contrails, which is like the jet streaks in the air, curling behind it like twisting spines. "Oh, God, an American plane!" someone shouted. The guards looked stricken. Martindale heard them speaking to each other in high agitation. One phrase stood out. "Be ninju ku." Louie, like all the POWs, had no idea what kind of plane this was. Then a POW who'd just been captured said it was a new American bomber called a B-29. A cheer rang out. Men began shouting, "B-29! B-29!" The bomber was the most beautiful thing that Louie had ever seen. Across the bay, masses of civilians stood in the streets looking at the sky. As the plane passed into the civilians' view, Frank Tinker heard the people shouting, sounds that blended into a roar. Louie glanced toward the south end of the camp. The bird was standing just outside his office, motionless and expressionless, watching the plane. It was not their Messiah, Martindale wrote, but ours. So remember, for the prisoners, they're realizing that if the Americans have this new plane, a new weapon, that means that the war could end sooner, the Americans could win, and the prisoners could be free. And so that's why they're saying it's their Messiah, their like savior Jesus figure. The bomber was flying at perfect liberty. Stickley guided it in a series of straight runs over the city as his crewmen snapped photographs. Below, the guards began pursuing the elated, the really happy POWs, trying to force them back into the barracks. The men shushed each other, fearing that they'd be beaten for celebrating. The clamor, the noise and excitement died down. Louie stood with the other men and watched the bomber, occasionally darting between barracks to avoid the guards. Stickley flew over Tokyo for more than an hour. Remember, he's the one taking the pictures. No Japanese planes or guns engaged him. Finally, as he turned back for Saipan, a Zero, which remembers the Japanese fighter planes, banked up for his tail, followed briefly, then turned away. Newspapers were relatively easy to come by in Omori. Slave laborers snuck them in, and each day at his worksite, Milton McCullen gave a Korean truck driver a bag of stolen rice in exchange for a small English-language paper, which McCullen smuggled into camp in his boot. For the POWs, the papers were inexhaustibly amusing. Though the Japanese press covered the European theater accurately, it was notorious, or famous in a bad way, for distorting the news of the Pacific War, which is like the Japanese front, sometimes absurdly. Louie once read a story about a Japanese pilot who ran out of ammunition in a dogfight and downed his opponent with a rice ball. On the day after the B-29 flyover, the coverage wore a similar stripe. Paper says, "Lone enemy B-29 visits Tokyo area," wrote POW Ernest Narquist in his diary. It said it came from the Mariana Island group, flew over the city, and was drive off, and this little seek means that that's exactly how the guy wrote about it in his diary. So we would say driven off, but he wrote drive off, so they kept the quote the same. Anyway, it was drive off without dropping a single bomb. I laughed as I read the words driven off, for neither the anti-aircraft fire nor the Zeros had come within miles of that great big beautiful bird. Louie saw another headline that said the bomber had filed in consternation. This is one of our vocab words. It means a sudden disappointment that can cause confusion. I mean, like you're surprised by something but kind of upset about it. The plane had simply crossed over Tokyo, but everyone in Japan, captive and free, knew what it meant. Every morning, the Omori POWs were assembled and ordered to call out their number in Japanese. After November 1st, 1944, the man assigned number 29 would sing out, "Nijuku," at the top of his lungs. Not even bayonet prods, wrote Wade, could wipe the smiles from the POW faces now. So even though this B-29, all it did was fly over. Nothing happened. There was no bombing. Everyone's realizing that this could be the thing that would change the war. So everyone's really excited about it in the POW camp. Louie wasn't smiling for long. The B-29 and what it portended fed the bird's vitriol, his anger. One day, Louie was in his barracks, sitting with friends far in the rear, out of the sight of the door in case the bird came. As the men passed around a cigarette rolled in toilet paper, 2 guards banged in, screaming, "Kiri!" Louie leapt up in tandem with the other men. In bounded the bird. For several seconds, the bird looked around. He took a few steps into the room, and Louie came into his view. The corporal rushed down the barracks and halted before Louie. He wore the webbed belt that Louie had seen on him his first day in Omori. The buckle was several inches square, made of heavy brass. Standing before Louie, the bird jerked the belt off his waist and grasped one end with both hands. "You come to attention last!" The bird swung the belt backwards with the buckle on the loose end and then whipped it around himself and forward as if he were performing a hammer throw. The buckle rammed into Louie's left temple and ear. Louie felt as if he had been shot in the head. Though he had resolved never to let the bird knock him down, the power of the blow and the explosive pain that followed overawed everything in him. His legs seemed to liquefy and he went down. The room spun. Louie lay on the floor dazed, his head throbbing, blood running from his temple. When he gathered his wits, the bird was crouching over him, making a sympathetic, almost maternal, motherly sound, a sort of "ah." He pulled a fold of toilet paper from his pocket and pressed it gently into Louie's hand. Louie held the paper to his temple. And remember, this is kind of what the bird's famous for. He'll do these terrible things like whack Louie with his giant belt buckle and then come and be like nurturing and motherly and try and comfort the man. It's very unsettling. "Oh, it's stop, eh?" the bird said, his voice soft. Louie pulled himself upright. The bird waited for him to steady himself. The soothing voice and the offer of the paper for his wound were revelations to Louie. There was compassion in this man. The sense of relief was just entering his mind when the buckle, whirling around from the bird's swinging arms, struck his head again, exactly where it had hit before. Louie felt pain bursting through his skull, his body going liquid again. He smacked into the floor. So just as Louie's realizing that in the bird there actually could be some compassion, just some humanity, the bird comes and hits him again. For several weeks, Louie was deaf in his left ear. The bird continued to beat him every day. As his attacker struck him, Louie bore it with clenched fists and eyes blazing. But the assaults were wearing him down. The corporal began lording over his dream life, coming at him and pounding him, his features alight in vicious rapture. Louie spent hour after hour in prayer, begging for God to save him. He lost himself in fantasies of running through an Olympic stadium, climbing onto a podium, and he thought of home, tormented by thoughts of what his disappearance must have done to his mother. He longed to write to her, but there was no point. Once, a Japanese officer had announced that men could write home, and everyone in the camp penned letters to their parents, wives, children, and study girls. When the bird learned of it, he called in Commander Mayer, handed him the letters, and forced him to burn them. One day in mid-November, Louie was sitting in his barracks when the bird walked in and approached him, accompanied by 2 Japanese strangers. Louie expected a beating, but instead the strangers were friendly. They told Louie that they were producers from Radio Tokyo and that they had something they thought he'd like to see. They handed Louie a piece of paper. Louie looked at it. It was a transcript of an NBC radio broadcast announcing his death. The transcript was real. Louie's death declaration, delivered in June, had reached the American media on November 12th, the same week. The Radio Tokyo men wanted Louie to come to their studio to announce that he was alive on the Postman Call show. Remember, that's the same show that they talked about Louie being alive on in the last chapter. They wanted Louie to do this, they said, for his sake and for that of his suffering family. He was free to write his own message. Louie didn't trust them and gave them no answer. They told them to take a day and think about it. Louie consulted Martindale, who told him that several POWs had made such broadcasts, and as long as Louie didn't read propaganda or false statements supporting Japan, there was no harm in accepting. So Louie said yes. The Radio Tokyo men brought him pen and paper, and he set to work. Knowing that his family might not believe that it was really he added details that he hoped would convince them. To ensure that his message got through, he decided to speak positively about his captors. So he's going to say positive things about Japan and about the camp so that they don't censor his message or take his message down. He included the names of other POWs who feared that their families thought they were dead, and also mentioned Bill Harris, whom he'd last seen a month and a half earlier at Ofuna. He opted not to mention Phil. He hadn't seen the pilot for 8 months and didn't know if he was still alive. Louie was driven to the Radio Tokyo studio. The producers greeted him as if he were a beloved friend. They read his speech and gave it hearty approval. It would be taped for broadcast 2 days later. The producers planned to use that evening's broadcast to tease the audience, then wait before presenting his voice to the world, proof that they were telling the truth. Louie was taken to the microphone and given his cue. He read his message to the pleasure of the producers. As the officials prepared to drive him back to Omori, Louie went to a producer who had been especially kind. He said there was a man in camp named Watanabe who was beating the POWs. The producer seemed concerned and told Louie that he'd see what he could do. In San Francisco at 2:30 on the morning of November 18, 1944, a young woman named Lynn Moody was alone in the Office of War Information, working the graveyard shift. Across the hall in the Federal Communications Commission station, one of her colleagues was listening to Japanese radio and typing up broadcasts for review by propaganda analysis. Moody was bored, so she crossed the hall to say hello. The colleague asked if Moody could fill in while she took a break. Moody slipped on the earphones and began typing. The show airing was Postman Calls. As she typed, Moody was startled to hear a name that she knew well, Louie Zamperini. Moody was a member of the USC class of 1940, and Louie was an old friend. The announcer was speaking about the October 18th message that had been broadcast, supposedly from Louie, but in fact written without Louie's knowledge, which was the one that we read about in the previous chapter. Giddy with excitement, Moody typed, placing unclear words within parentheses. Exactly 1 month ago, we broadcast a message. This message, over the same station, same program, Postman Calls, was from First Lieutenant Louis Sylvie Zamperini, United States Army Air Corps. Recently, a news report has been brought to our attention in which it is stated that First Lieutenant Louis Zamperini is listed as dead by the United States War Department. According to the report, Lieutenant Zamperini was reported missing in action in the South Pacific in May 1943. The apparently uninformed source of this item is a broadcasting station in California, quoting the War Department of the United States of America. We hope we can rectify or fix this mistake on someone's part by saying that Louis Zamperini is alive and well as a prisoner of war here in Tokyo. This is one of the many examples of the men missing in action, erroneously or in error, wrongly, reported and later being established as a lie. The last war was full of such instances, and much suffering and heartaches could have been avoided by the transmittal of reliable information to the parties concerned regarding the whereabouts of men in such cases. It is one of the purposes of this program to alleviate this condition and furnish speedy, reliable, authentic message service to the relatives and friends of men interned in prisoner of war camps throughout Japan. We sincerely hope Louis's mother is listening in tonight or will be informed of what we say. So they're setting it up here as like, look at the U.S., they're always getting it wrong, telling people that men have died when really they're fine, they're here, they're safe, let us be the good guys and help you out and tell you that they're alive. Long will Louis Zamperini's name live in our memories. Those of us from the regions of Southern California well recall the days that Louis was breaking all records in the mile run. His unbroken national interscholastic mile record stands as a challenge to the aspirants of the Ginger Cup. We followed closely Zamperini's efforts in the 1936 Olympic Games held in Berlin, Germany. His opponents and some of the foremost in the country speak highly of him. He has run against such names as Ben Sig, remember parentheses means she's not exactly sure what they said on the radio, and Cunningham. The same personality that so endeared him to us as he raced against time on the tracks of the world is not dead, but very much alive and with us yet. We regret the unhappiness that must have accompanied the news of his reported death, but hopes that the efforts of his fellow prisoners of war on Postman Calls will atone in some small way for the error. So chin up, Mrs. Louis Zamperini of Torrance, California. Louis is here, the same old Louis, cheerful, sportsmanlike, and the idol of all our Southern California fans and graduates. You might pass the glad tidings along, Mrs. Zamperini, for we know all the lovers of the spiked shoe sport will be glad to hear this. Louis is not on the track any more, and for that we are sorry. He will be missed there. Louis is neither missing nor dead, as he's been reported, and for that we are more than glad. It makes us very happy indeed to have performed this service for our prisoners and relatives, and it is our earnest wish that no such instances of this information will be forthcoming. We hope this little group of prisoners connected with Postman Call's program can be of further service in the future. That's what we're here for, so keep on listening, Mrs. Zamperini, and don't mention it. The pleasure is all ours. Moody typed as fast as she could, making a string of typos in her exhilaration and her excitement. About an hour later, the FCC woman came back. I practically danced around the room telling her about it, Moody later wrote. Down the coast in Torrance, the Zapparinis were coping with the aftermath of the public announcement of Louie's death. After a package came bearing Louie's Purple Heart, a letter arrived concerning his life insurance payout, $10,000. Louise deposited the money in the bank, but she didn't spend any of it. When Louie came home, she declared it would be his. And after the news of Louie's death broke, the film director, Cecil B. DeMille, showed up to do a radio interview with the family for the 6th War Bond Drive. Sylvia and Louise were given scripts that called for them to speak of Louie as if he were dead. Out of politeness, the Zamparinis read the scripts as written. Somewhere in all of this, a delivery man came bearing a bouquet of flowers for Sylvia. It was an anniversary gift from her husband Harvey, now manning a tank gun in Holland. A few days later, she got a telegram. Harvey had been wounded. The telegram said nothing of what his injuries were or how serious. Sylvia waited, nodded with anxiety. Remember, this is Louie's sister. Finally, a letter arrived, composed by Harvey and dictated to a nurse from his hospital bed. His tank had been hit and had burst into flames. He had escaped, but his hands and face were burned. Of all the terrible scenarios that had run through Sylvia's mind, fire was one thing that she'd never imagined. Harvey was, after all, a firefighter. Exhausted and barely able to eat, Sylvia crept through November, haunted by nightmares and growing ever more gaunt. Gaunt is like pale, skinny, kind of sickly. On November 20th, Lynn Moody, still in high spirits over the broadcast about Louie 2 days before, was back working in the midnight to 8 shift. At 2:30 a.m., one of the FCC transcribers yelled to her to come quickly. Moody ran in, put on the earphones, and listened. It was Postman Calls again. Hello, America, the announcer began. This is the Postman calling and bringing a special message, as promised earlier in tonight's program, to Mrs. Louis Zamperini, 2028 Gramercy Street, Torrance, California. We hope Mrs. Zamperini is listening in tonight, for we have a real treat for her. Her son has come down to the studio especially to send her this message of reassurance after the erroneous report, error-filled wrong report, of a few days ago by the United States War Department that he was officially given up as dead and missing. We assure Mrs. Zamperini that such is not the case. The next voice heard will be that of First Lieutenant Louis Halsey Zamperini. Remember, his middle name is Sylvie, but that's what they got down as they transcribed or wrote it down. United States Air Force, now interned in the Tokyo camp. Go right ahead, Lieutenant Zamperini. A young man's voice came across the airwaves. Moody knew the instant she heard it. It was Louie. Hello, Mother and Father, relatives, and friends. This is your Louie talking. Through the courtesy of the authorities here, I am broadcasting this personal message to you. This will be the first time in 2.5 years that you will have heard my voice. I'm sure it sounds the same to you as it did when I left home. I am uninjured and in good health and can hardly wait until the day we are together again. Not having heard from you since my most abrupt departure, I have been somewhat worried about the condition of the family as far as health is concerned. I hope this message finds all of you in the best of health and good spirits. I am now interned at the Tokyo Prisons Camp and am being treated as well as can be expected under wartime conditions. The camp authorities are kind to me, and I have no kick coming. Please write as often as you can, and in doing so, send me snapshots of everyone. In my lonesome hours, nothing would be more appreciated than to look at pictures of the family. Before I forget it, Dad, I would be very pleased if you would keep my guns in good condition so we might do some good hunting when I return home. Mother, Sylvia, and Virginia, I hope you'll keep up your wonderful talents in the kitchen. I often visualize those wonderful pies and cakes you make. Is Pete still able to pay you for his weekly visits from San Diego? I hope he is still near home. Give my best to Gorton, Harvey, Eldon, and Henry, and wish them the best of care. I send my fondest love to Sylvia, Virginia, and Pete, and hope they're enjoying their work at the present. I miss them very much. Remember, he tried to put in these specific things about his family so that they would know it was really Louie. It wasn't just a setup. Since I've been in Japan, I have run into several of my old acquaintances. You'll probably remember a few of them. And remember, this is a sneaky way to talk about some of the other prisoners of war so that their families can get the word out that these men are still alive. The tall Marine, William Harris from Kentucky, is here and enjoying good health. Lawrence Stoddard Stanley Meneve and Peter Riskinich are the same. You must remember William Hasty from Bishopville. We've been rooming together for the past 2 months. He is looking fine. I know that you have taken care of my personal belongings and saving long ago. You have no doubt received the rest of my belongings from the Army. Hello to Bob Llewellyn and all of my hometown friends. Before closing, I wish you a Merry Xmas and a Happy New Year. Your loving son, Louie. Later that day, the phone rang at the Zamparinis' house. The caller was a woman from the nearby suburb of San Marino. She said that she'd been listening to a radio when the station had aired an intercepted broadcast of an American prisoner of war speaking on Japanese radio. The broadcast had been scratchy and indistinct, but she was sure that she had heard the name right. The POW she had heard, she said, was Louie. The Zamparinis were shocked and wary. The woman was a stranger, and they were afraid she was a prankster. Sylvia and Louise asked for her address and drove to her house. The woman told them everything she heard. Sylvia and Louise thanked her and left. Remember, they've been missing their son for years. Well, 2.5 years? And now they're trying to adjust to this idea that he's dead. They've just gotten his Purple Heart medal and his life insurance, and now this lady comes and said he's alive, same week. They believed the woman, but they didn't know if they could believe the broadcast itself. It could easily have been faked. I was thinking, could it be true? Could it be true? Sylvia recalled. After Sylvia and Louise got home, a Western Union telegram arrived from the Provost Marshal General. It read, "Following enemy propaganda broadcast from Japan has been intercepted. Below were Louie's words, as typed by Moody." The telegram ended with a disclaimer. Pending further confirmation, this report does not establish his status as a prisoner of war. Messages began pouring in from friends and strangers all over the country, telling the Zamparinis of the broadcast, which had been intercepted and re-aired on several stations. And Louie's uncle Gildo Dosey called from Wilmington, Iowa. He clicked on his radio and heard a voice that he felt certain was that of his nephew. The messages relaying the content of the broadcast were varied, but a common thread ran through several of them, a request that they take care of Louie's guns. Louie had grown up hunting, shooting rabbits in the fields around Torrance and the Coahuila Indian Reservation, and he was especially careful with his guns. To the Zamparinis, this was the fingerprint, the details that the Japanese could not have known. Louise and Sylvia dissolved in tears, then began shouting with joy. Pete picked up the phone, dialed Peyton Jordan's number, and shouted 3 words into the receiver. "Pete, he's alive." And on that happy note, we'll pause till the next chapter.